how do we start to create environments where if the work can't change, the way people feel can?
Yeah.
And how do we start to build towards that? How do we give people the ability to make more choices, whether that be the choice in the hours they work, where they work, who they work with, what benefits they'd like, their mentors. There are so many other choices that can be made by somebody outside of the work they do.
Dante, welcome to Empathy Led. Should I say welcome back to Empathy Led? We've tried this a couple of times already, so hopefully third time is the charm.
I'm happy to be back.
How you doing today, my brother?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Pumped, ready to go.
Awesome. I feel the same way.
So I'm trying to find creative ways to learn about people, their formative years, their background. And it occurred to me that you can learn a lot about someone by understanding what their early influences are. So who were was your hero or heroes growing up?
That's a really good way to start. It's also a pretty emotional place for me because most of them aren't here anymore. And it kind of brings up those feelings that could push me to a place to where I'll probably cry, just to be transparent. I'll say that I was really blessed and lucky to be born in the family I was born in the neighborhood I was born in, at the time I was born. And I mean that in the truest sense of all of it, because my family, by the time I'd gotten here, had already experienced so much and accomplished so much that there was somewhat of a path for me in this world in terms of how to act, how to treat people, how to view yourself, not even the world, because the world can often label us and the world can often shape the way we view ourselves. And the people that I was raised by had already experienced so much of that they made it very clear to me that who I was as important as anything in this world. And being able to hold on to that would be something that would help me move forward, given life's ups and downs and what I'd experienced. So I'll say it was my great-grandmother, who we called Mum. She was blind. She raised all of us. She lived by herself after my great-grandfather passed when I was a few years old. And I distinctly remember going to the second floor of her home, which was on 54th in Westminster in West Philly. And she would always hear me doing stuff I wasn't supposed to be doing. And she knew the home like the back of her hand. So even in not necessarily being able to see me, she could always still catch me. And I remember her voice yelling up, telling me to get out of whatever I was in. I also have to highlight my grandfather, who was pretty old by the time I got here. In all honesty, he was born in 1910.
Wow.
By the time I was born, he was 80 years old. And he had seen so much and done so much. He was just cool. And I think if you talk to most of the people in my life, most of the people who knew him, most of the people in our neighborhood, that'd be one thing that they would say about him. Like, he was just a cool dude, and you just want to be around him because he had a great sense of humor. He always had a cool car, and he kept company with really interesting people. So if I could immediately think to people that shaped that, or the pieces of me that I think shine now outside of my parents, it would be my grandfather and my great-grandmother.
Yeah. It's pretty fascinating and interesting to me that your heroes were the patriarch and the matriarch of your family. I don't think many people grow up with those influences. At least, perhaps back then, it was still very much the case where grandparents and great grandparents were a part of our lives, but you don't really see it that much anymore. So, what are some of the things? Let's focus on your grandpa. What are some of the lessons, some of the teaching that you took and that continue to guide you to this day?
He was very big on respect, particularly when it came to the way men interact. He was very big on respect, where it's something that you lead with. It's something that really shows the world who you are, and is also a sense of, or I should say, is also a place where you hold strength. Because again, where I grew up, it was a tough place. But there was a code and an understanding amongst men that he taught me, where there will always be a recognition amongst men who are respectful to one another, that we should hold that. Because if you don't, then the consequences of that can be very serious, extremely serious. Um, he was also mindful of kind of my dating life, and and how I viewed my responsibility as a partner. And something he would tell me is, no matter who you are outside, or who you are in the street, or who you are in the world, when you come home, you leave all of that out there. You leave all of that out there, because you shouldn't have to feel as though you need to be tough at home. You shouldn't feel as though you need to be always so strong at home, because that's the reason you're there, so that you don't have to carry all of that. And those two things, next to just how to be a host. My grandpa would have people coming in and out of his house all the time when I was there. And when they would walk in, they would immediately walk past me. They'd say hi. And there's a name that my family calls me that I don't know if I'll say right now, but they would walk by, they'd say hi, they'd give my grandpa a handshake or something, and then they'd walk into his living room and go into what I think would be considered like a china closet, and underneath is where he kept his alcohol.
That's it.
And that was just the ritual, where no matter who it was, open door policy, they walk in, hey, Dante, what's up, JC? Because his name was James, and there were a lot of James on his block when he grew up, so he got JC, and they would just walk past him, go right for whatever their taste was at the time, and sit down, and then start talking. And that was something that I definitely took with me as well, where I love to host, and I love to create an environment where people feel as though they don't need anything, because it's already there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. I always love stories of multi-generational bonds. There is so much richness and wisdom that is exchanged in those interactions, and I love it when the elderly also feel as though they have something to learn from the youngins, which is sound as if you had that kind of relationship with your grandpa, where of course he was the one bestowing all the wisdom, but it seems to me that your relationship was such that he felt, through you, he could keep a pulse on what the youngins were up to these days, on those days.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to put it. If you were to ask him, he'd probably say, like, the biggest thing he learned from me, or the largest thing that I was able to share with him, was when we got him a larger cable package.
Ooh.
he found out, you know, those like channels on the back end of Comcast that are like music choice. I showed him how to get to like the big band channel and like the jazz channel, and he would just keep that on all day. Like it was always on, it was always there. And I think that for him, because he didn't have to search the radio anymore, and by that point radio wasn't really playing jazz and big band and bebop and all of the things that were really his passion. So when I showed him that, like the world completely opened for him, and he could have this on at all times, and he could be really in his world and in his heyday whenever he wanted to.
Yeah, that's amazing. Whenever I talk to you, there is always a sense of somebody who is so self-aware, who is so introspective and so intentional with the words that he chooses and the way he chooses to express his thoughts and his ideas. Where does that come from?
I'll have to say it may be going back to the first question, where I was also raised by men who had spent a good bit of time in some sort of facility, right? I don't want to label it wrong, and from what I've heard, there are different terms, but we'll say men who have given some time, hypothetically, to different entities. As my son walks in, and a large part of what they taught me aligned with what my grandpa was teaching me in terms of respect. And what you say holds a lot of respect, not just what you say in terms of how you keep your word, right? When you say you're going to do something, you do it, but what you say. Simple words could cause a reaction or create something that you may not want and that you may not necessarily even mean. So I learned in that, where in an environment, life and death is seconds away if you do or say something.
Let's say hi.
Yeah, let's say hi. Come say hi. Hello, how are you?
Say hi.
Hi.
Hi. What's your name?
What's your name?
Noah.
Noah. Nice to meet you, Noah.
He said, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I
What do
just
you
got
have
my
to-
booster shot.
You just got your booster shot. How would you describe your dad?
He said, how would you describe your dad? How would you describe me? One word. What's a word you would use to describe me if someone said, what's your dad like?
Bald.
Bald.
Bald. I love that. I love that so much. He has a double entendre.
Said he loves that answer a lot. All right, go down and see mommy.
But
Thank
she's putting me to bed.
Okay. Bald.
Bald. I like it.
Yeah.
That's a poet right there.
He can be.
You know?
He can be.
Because daddy is in fact bald.
Very much so. Sorry, I yeah, I don't want to ramble about that, but I think the value and the cost of words, something that I'm always weighing in my mind, and also I feel given what I do for a living, silence is good. Like having some space in between what you're thinking and what you say is good, especially given how quickly we can see things happen based on a misstep or a misquote or a misphrase. I'm always mindful of that as well. So I'd rather take my time and be a bit more measured in what I say than just coming out and saying something that I may not mean.
There is a couple of things for me. The first thing is most people are unaware of the space that you just talked about between your thoughts and your emotions and the actions that you ultimately decide to take to respond to whatever situation is at hand. And then the second piece is most people use a lot of filler words or are in a hurry to speak because as people we are generally uncomfortable with the silence that a longer pause brings. What is it about you that makes you aware of the space that exists between stimuli and action and makes you so comfortable with the gaps between the words and the pauses that frighten people so much?
One would probably be therapy. When I was younger, I still wrestle with this, but I'm a fairly impulsive person by nature.
Hmm.
I'm a very active person. I can easily get swept away in the moment or in a thought that then becomes an action, and it's cost me. It cost me quite a few things. It cost me my soccer career. It cost me a lot of money. It cost me reputation at times. It almost cost me my relationship.
Hmm.
So therapy was a place where I was able to unpack a lot of that. I shouldn't say unpack. I think that word's used too much. Therapy was a place where I was able to sit and experience it, like the actual flow of a thought. Sorry, it starts with the emotion, which then becomes the thought, which then becomes the action. And in recognizing that, I felt like I had unlocked something that could save my life, that could save my relationships, that could save whatever it was that I wanted to become or accomplish in this world. So that's one. And then there's always that reinforcement of it. I find that often the universe will take something that you're either working on, thinking through, struggling with, and then reinforce it with something that could be completely outside of where you expected that reinforcement to come from. So to kind of squirrel on this, there was a podcast I was listening to specifically when I was in music journalism with a guy named X Rated, and X Rated was convicted of a very serious crime in the early 1990s as a teenager in Sacramento, and it was a high profile case. He got a lot of time and he spent a lot of time behind bars. And something he spoke to was as he got older and as he started to learn more, he realized that a lot of the men he was around largely found themselves there because of decisions they made and actions that they had taken that were no more than 5 minutes. Split second decisions that saw them getting life without parole, some even the death penalty. And he started to realize that for the betterment of himself and also the men who found themselves in those positions, learning the way their brain works, learning how emotions fuel our thoughts, which then become actions, and then separating all three and putting space in between would be life changing. So the therapy piece and then that wild interview brought it all together and allowed for me to make it a daily exercise that I often find myself in and experiencing, and I guess in this moment showing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a hyperbole to say that the ability to find those gaps between emotion, thoughts, and action is a life-changing discovery. It's a life-changing skill. In my life, it was a life-changing discovery for sure to understand that I could choose. I could choose my responses, that they were not imposed upon me, that I may not be able to choose my thoughts, and perhaps not be able to choose my emotions or how I feel in a particular moment, but I definitely had control over how I chose to respond. But the opportunity to choose my response is only available if you find the gap, the space that exists between emotions, thoughts, and action. Otherwise, all three are experienced simultaneously, therefore, leaving you no room to act, and leaving you only with reaction that in some cases can cost you a whole lot.
You know, there's a quote that my therapist gave me from Viktor Frankl that speaks directly to this when it became real for me, and I started to recognize like it wasn't a me thing. It was this is how our bodies are wired.
Mm.
The quote was, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And that was like, okay, it kind of felt like, to be sacrilegious, like part of my 10 commandments, where
Yep.
I knew no matter what was happening, no matter what experience I was in recognizing that it is always real, no matter what our mind tells us, it is always real, that I can always choose, like you said. And those choices are powerful. Like to feel as though you can choose is powerful and empowering.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you mentioned therapy. While it has become a part of popular conversation, and while traditionally Black men like you and me used to find it a foreign thing, and you can see more and more people embracing the practice and the benefits of it. Like, when were you introduced to therapy, and what was it about you or your environment or your influences that made it okay for you to go to therapy?
I was introduced to therapy actually when I was a lot younger, just from conversations I'd overhear. And I remember those conversations not being so positive, right? The idea that therapy was for people who were crazy, right? That dismissive word, or for people who were weak, was something that I definitely heard growing up. So it was something that you kind of just put in the mental Rolodex. And as you get older, whenever you see it, you start to put two and two together, and that's how you would judge that person, or that's what you would use as your reason not to get close to it. It wasn't until I truly crashed out, lost my soccer career for the first time, really felt as though my identity had been either diminished or lost completely, depending on what time of day you may have found me after soccer. And it was starting to impact everything. I wasn't feeling like going to class. If I was going to class, I wasn't focused. If I was taking tests, I wasn't performing. I wasn't interacting with friends the same way that I used to. Everything was being impacted, and I started to notice it. So I called my mom, and I remember saying to her, like, look, I don't know what's happening, but it's not good, right? Like I don't feel good, and I don't feel like myself. So together we found that my school, West Virginia University, the West Virginia University, let's go Mountaineers, had a counseling center called the Careots Center. And personally, I believe, because of where I was and because of the fact that my mom didn't make any judgments, she was just trying to be my mom and was just trying to support me, that the path to getting support was there was no friction. I honestly showed up, told them what was going on, and in a matter of moments, I started to take what would be considered now, as I know, a screener. And that screener touched on all things, from thinking back on the questions I was asked, like addictive behaviors, self-destructive behaviors, ADD. It was a pretty expansive assessment. I remember taking probably between an hour and 2 hours. And after that, I immediately found some things out. So again, the low level of friction. I found out that I had ADD, and I'd had it for a long time, and that was good to know now at 19 going on 20, because it really made sense of the world for me, and how I interacted with the world and my natural energy, and how I could go from one thing to the next or do multiple things at one time and it feel normal. From there, I was then paired with a counselor. So I went back, of course, and then I was able to have sessions. And in those sessions, kind of started the way this did, where they asked me about my childhood and things I remember and moments that rise. And through all that, I found out I had PTSD and I had survivor's guilt based on just certain things I had experienced in the environment. And throughout all of it, it didn't feel like work. It felt like I was getting a lot of things out that I hadn't had the ability to talk about. I didn't have I'll put it this way. I grew up in a home where, like, my mom and my pop, I knew they loved each other. They didn't say it. I grew up in an environment where I knew my mom and pop loved me. They didn't say it. It was a more, because my pop came home every day and his pop didn't, that was the example of love. Because I had a roof over my head, and because my parents paid for the things that I needed and I didn't want for anything, that was love. And so I wasn't an emotive person. I wasn't the kind of person to even be able to talk about those things. But for some reason in that environment, I was able to. And that's where I first started to realize how powerful just having someone on the other side who's listening, who can mirror back what you're saying so that you feel heard, and then who can ultimately help you start to think through what tomorrow looks like, or what next week looks like, or what a month from then looks like, in terms of little pieces of work you can do in between. That's really where therapy started to become, I think for me, it became an advantage, to be honest, because I don't know what life would be without it at this point. And I'm usually the person who, when there is someone in my life and they're thinking about doing it, they come to me. Like, I remember my homies used to say, like, if something would happen and it would seem a bit, we'll say, softer to them, they would say, like, oh, talk to Tay about that. Like, he goes to therapy, and like, and like, I never took it as a slight, because I knew just the fact that they knew I went, and the fact that they felt as though I was someone they could talk to about those things that may feel uncomfortable, was something. I knew it was something.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is something powerful about now, whether or not they will admit it to themselves. It was an option. It was available. It was okay now. They, quote unquote, had the permission. May they choose to go because somebody they know, their trust, their love was modeling it for them. And I think there's something powerful to that. So I know your work, but even outside of it, it's very obvious just how engaged you are in the well-being movement for people, us as individuals, but also at work. Like, do you attribute that, I want to call it passion, but maybe it's not a passion, but would you attribute that passion for well-being to therapy and those things that you learn in that environment? Like, What's the origin story there?
I definitely attribute it to therapy. I'd also attribute it to experience in the workplace, because there are a lot of, we naturally do this as people where we come up with excuses why we shouldn't do stuff because we think the place or the space or what we do makes this approach or makes whatever the solution is ineffective. It just gives us an excuse not to do any work, right? Where like people say like, oh, this is fashion, so that won't work here. Or this is big law, that won't work here. Whereas I've worked in about 5 different industries and I've seen the same problems in every industry. And the problem always boils down to people. And it boils down to people not feeling as though what they get out of work is worth what they put in. Full stop. The first time I realized, one, that the workplace wasn't real and that it's just a construct of a bunch of ideas that we've put together to create this very flawed system, is when I started an internship my senior year in college while still taking, I think I was still at about like 35 hours of credits a week.
Oh, wow.
And it was so different than what I was living at work. Right? Like I was taking ag business classes, I was taking econ classes, I was taking business management classes, and then I was going to work at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which is a pretty fast-paced, high-performance, high-touch environment with the public, and none of it applied. Nothing that they told me applied. So I'd go to work 6 o'clock in the morning, sit in my classes, realize that this is actually setting up everyone in this class for failure. And then I'd go back to work and I'd do what I knew worked. And it wasn't what they were teaching. There's a real movement that I'm actually enjoying right now where a lot of the larger voices that sit in certain seats are speaking to how misaligned what we learn is or are, depending on the grammar there, to how we work. One of my favorite people, I'm definitely not going to get her name right, but I want to try my best too. So if you could give me 1 second, it's right here because I always have to give credit where the good things come from. But it's a woman she spent a large part of her career in positioning. And I'm going to find the name. She talked about just how wrong we teach B2B sales in college, higher ed, whatever we want to call it, compared to how it works. And we largely use the DTC model as like, oh, you could just plug this into enterprise sales. And it doesn't work that way. In the same way that you learn, if you take another language, when you learn it from a book, it does not work when you go speak to someone when it's their native language. Right? So in this tangent, I guess my point is, in working in high stress, high performing retail, in working in fashion, in working in tech, and 2 different kind of startups, right? Like one was a cloud monitoring company and another one was consumer generated content, right? So like very different companies, very different business models, to then leave that, start my company, and then to work at an agency, and they all had the same problems. That's kind of where my passion comes from, where I don't so much so believe it's plug this thing in and everything will be fine. It's how do we start to create environments where if the work can't change, the way people feel can? And how do we start to build towards that? And I think a large part of that is how do we give people the ability to make more choices, whether that be the choice in the hours they work, or whether that be the choice in where they work, or that be the choice in who they work with, or the choice in what benefits they'd like, or the choice in their mentors. There are so many other choices that can be made by somebody outside of the work they do. It may be rigid. If you were an investment banker, there are just some things you have to do as an investment banker. But what choices can you make that allow for you to show up and feel really good to do your best work as that investment banker? Same thing rings true for somebody who's on the floor of a luxury retail brand. You're going to have to talk to people. You're going to have to sell. You're going to have to work really hard. What can we do to help them in empowering them or creating an environment where there are choices they can make to give them the best chance to show up as their best selves? And then when they walk away from it, they know, like, okay, cool, that I still feel good about me. I still feel good about who I am. I still feel good about my place in this world because I was able to make choices that align with my lived experience and what I want. And I can do this every day. Or, you know, if I don't want to, I don't have to. But I think that's really where I'm coming from, that people make a lot of excuses in why these things won't work in different industries when I've been in 5 of them and they all have the same problems.
Yeah. So where does the gap exist? Because everything you said about the kind of environment that we need to create for people to feel valued and to have choices, it all feel reasonable. And maybe I'm naive in believing that for the most part, that is what leaders and companies want as well. But in practice, well, it's not happening. So there is a disconnect somewhere. So have you been able to figure out, since you are in the space, where that disconnect may lie?
I think the gap largely lies, there are a few gaps, right? There are quite a few gaps. If you kind of dig deep into the people who sit in this, I want to say just recently Deloitte said there are like 6 gaps. So it's not one single gap. The ones that I think that are the most pressing is the gap between really leaders and their belief of what work is and employees and what they think work should be. I think that's a major gap, right? Because as a leader, of course, there are those things you have to do, right? You know, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I think the gentleman said that his main role as a CEO is to provide the largest alpha for his shareholders at least 30 times over the course of an hour. Like, that's how he sees himself. That's his passion. That's what he loves to do. Provide the largest amount of value, and at times, like, unimaginable amounts of value for his shareholders. Cool. That's what your role is. At the same time, you need your people to help you execute the goals that will get you ultimately, or I should say, to help you execute the things that you need to accomplish that goal. How they do that should most likely not be dictated by you, because of often how separated you are from the day-to-day. So that's 2, where we've created in small organizations the idea that separation is needed, right? Like I've seen small organizations, like 20 people, operate as if they're 300 or 3,000 people, where the leader loses track of the product, the leader loses track of the day-to-day, the leader loses track of clients. Like, because they think like, oh, I'm just in here to provide like vision and to provide, you know, the overall ethos so everybody can go out into the world and do the work. I think that's another piece that's missing, where the really good companies, their leaders know and understand what every single person does. They know and understand what their clients, who their clients are, what their clients need. Often will hop in if there's a problem with a client, no matter how separated they are. Not to say any names, but there's a leader of a really, really good company who we got on a call with and found out like, okay, there's a problem with this client. He hadn't been doing client facing things because of just how his role changed, but he remembered working with them. He hopped back into that deal because of just what he knew and because that's how they work. So the gap is largely in what leaders believe work is and what people think it should be. And then often in that separation between leader and the people who are doing it every day. And I think all of it boils down to trust. It all boils down to trust, whether that be in the first example, leaders not trusting people to make good decisions and not trusting that they'll actually get their work done if it feels different and if it's not as rigid and if it's not in office. And the second piece is the lack of trust, where if I'm doing this and I never see my leader, or my leader I know doesn't know how much, how different billing a client is now versus what it was 3 years ago when they created the product, then I'm not going to trust you so much in the decisions you make. I'm not going to trust you so much in how you lead this organization. And all that creates very real problems that we see affect businesses every day.
Yeah. Yeah. There is something that you touched on. A leader has a vision or a specific goal, but they depend on their employees and the people in their charge to deliver and fulfill that vision. I call that the paradox of leadership, which is, you are ultimately accountable for things that you are not responsible for. And you need to trust that the people in your charge will be able to do their job. And your job is not to push them out of the way and do it yourself. You can't. You have to create an environment where there is trust and there is all these ingredients that needs to happen, because, well, it's only through them that you can get what you want. And you only get what you want if you are able to provide them what they need. And it's a very tricky thing for leaders. So how are you all at Careots endeavoring to bridge those gaps?
So there are two things that we do that touch on, I think, both sides of the point I was trying to make. The first thing is, we know that most organizations, most companies are spending a large amount of money on things to show they care, right? Largely decided or labeled as rewards, benefits, comp, whatever you want to call it. We know that a lot of organizations are spending a lot of money on those things to show people they care. The disconnect is in people actually finding them and using them. Conversations we've had with some of the most forward-thinking companies in the world still bring us to a place to where you ask them how they're sharing benefits, or you ask them what they do after re-enrollment. How are you communicating and connecting people to the things that you're paying for? It's an email with a lot of links in it. Like companies that built very complicated, complex solutions are still sending an email, maybe two, to their employees, expecting them to understand the why behind it all and then wanting to dive in to use it. There's a breakdown of trust right there. Because if I don't know that you're doing these things, then I can assume you're not. And if I can assume you're not, whether that assumption is true or not, it's reality. And that perception is real. So if someone were to ask me like, yo, so, how much does your organization care about you? There could be 10 different benefits to help me on my mental health. But I'm in a really dark place and I don't know that. I say like, my company doesn't care about it. It doesn't care about me at all. I'm burning out and like, I have no support, none. I went to my manager, they don't know, right? Like, so it's through all rungs of the organization that people are lost when it comes to knowing what are the things that can help us, what are the tools, resources that we can use to help us feel better, to help us feel cared for, to help us show up and do our best work. So that's one. The second thing is being able to measure well-being. CHROs, CEOs, the C-suite, there's a lot of talk right now in terms of well-being and what it means. And full stop, they're feeling like maybe its time has passed. Right? It's starting to feel like the early miseducation, I should say, of DE&I. That's what well-being is starting to feel like. And it's starting to be categorized as mushy and gushy and soft and not a real driver of business, which is dangerous given what we know the market is doing, what the global economic market is experiencing, and just how expensive capital is. So people don't want to spend money on things that they can't immediately attribute to a line item, right, on their balance sheet. So it's being able to show a person where they are when it comes to their well-being and giving them something about them. It's not an employee satisfaction survey. It's not a do you like us survey. It's a 5-minute conversation that for most of our users is the first time that they've actually gotten a chance to sit down and see where they are in 6 different dimensions of well-being, starting with emotional, going to career, it's the largest driver, going to social, moving to financial, getting to physical, and then landing with community. Actually being able to see that, not only is it qualified in us explaining these pieces, but it's quantified. You get a number for it. You get an ability to see like, oh, I'm a 7 in my emotional well-being, so I'm thriving. Or, oh, I'm a 4 in my community well-being, so I'm suffering. There's a school of thought in a lot of this that people feel if you give them these scores that it'll just absolutely suck the spirit out of people, right? Like we've had conversations with some really interesting folks, specifically in the college athletic space. And they're like, well, if we do this for a whole program and the number's bad, we won't want to publish that, right? Like we just won't want to say what it is. When science has shown, no matter how high or low that score is, when people have the ability to see a score of where they are in different places, it actually helps them perform better. Right? It gives them something to hold on to that's solid, that says, okay, this is where I am. What does life better look like? And how do I get there? On the back end, we're de-identifying and aggregating everything. So now leadership has a loop of information and lived experience based on a population that they've never had before. Most companies have no idea where their people are when it comes to being able to answer a question like, is there a leader in my life that inspires my work? Most have no idea where their people are being able to answer a question like, compared to the people that I know, I feel financially secure. Right? Like all of these things are largely taboo and not asked because most of the time when we get surveys, we can see like It's just for the organization to extract information. It's not a conversation. So when you bring these two pieces together, we're much like Google Maps, helping that person, once knowing where they are, navigate to the resources that best align with who they are. So there's no more searching, there's no more looking. Trust starts to plummet because now I know, okay, I'm feeling like maybe I need something that can help me with my emotional well-being. And I see that my score is a 4 and the platform's recommended to me Talkspace. And it happens instantaneously. Or maybe we show that organization's EAP because we know no one's using it. So here's that. Or maybe I'm struggling with my financial well-being. Here's our 401k. Right? Like being able to connect people, because there are so many great things out there that are now being boiled down to point solutions because we're trying to make one thing for everyone, as opposed to taking all of the great things and giving people the ability to choose.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a good way to like tie everything up. You know, I think for me, the first piece there is again, this it starts with awareness, right? It starts with awareness. We talked about the relationship between, you know, emotion, thoughts, and action, and finding the space. All of that is awareness. You know, it's like the moment I'm aware, the moment I can put language to something, the moment I know where I stand, then for the first time, like I have an opportunity to act. I have an opportunity to choose, and I have an opportunity to make a different decision, to do things differently. You know, things that used to govern my life in the shadows now are brought to light, and for the first time, you know, there is a sense of perceived control over my life, over my career, over my financial situation, and for the company, you know, it becomes this thing where I don't have to guess what I need to do for people. You know, it's clear what they need from me. It's clear where they are struggling. It's clear, you know, what where they are lacking, and if I just give them what they need, then
But it's the fact that you hesitated there, right?
yeah.
Like it's the fact that it's such a novel and I should say it's such a revolutionary idea that companies would ask questions that may be hard to ask and may give very real truths of where you have gaps, but can ultimately give you what you need in order to give people what they need to do their best work, right? Like it's not crazy to think that if we treat people well and we give them the ability to choose the things they need to do well, that the organization will do well.
Yeah.
Right? Like a lot of this for me in just simplifying thinking, because a lot of this is changing the way people think. You know, one of our design tenets is tied to Apple and the way Apple changed how people think about computers. We want to do the same thing when it comes to how people think about well-being, where we believe well-being is it's active, not so much so being active like in the physical sense, but it's active. It's always moving, it's always changing, and it shows up in different ways for different people. But the change in thought and the simplicity of really all of this goes to how Uber became super effective. And it ties directly into your point about choice and control, or feeling you're in control, where I don't know if you remember this, but I was very early on Uber where like one was crazy. Like people were like, wait, you're getting into a stranger's car and they're going to take you somewhere, right? And like, you don't know who they are. You just have to get the right license plate. And I was like, yeah, like this is awesome. I don't want to walk all the way downtown from my apartment, right? So what Uber did that changed everything and really helped them build what they are now is they started to introduce for users the ability to see where your car was. Because when you first started, you didn't have the ability to see where your car was. You just get like, okay, your car will be here in 12 minutes. And then you get like a notification or a call. Whereas they turned on the ability to see where your car is. Like, right? Like it doesn't change how much time it's going to take. It could say an hour. But even in that hour, you can check it every 10 minutes and look and see like, oh, cool. Like they're going across the Verrazano, or, oh, cool. They're on 31st Avenue, wherever, right? It's that. It's, yes, it may not be exactly what you want in terms of the time that the car is coming to pick you up, or in terms of where your well-being is now, or where your organization's well-being is. But the fact that you know, and the fact that you have the ability to make decisions, to control, to have choice in all of it, absolutely changes the approach to not only showing people you care, but ultimately to how people begin to work.
Yeah.
And I think that's where most of the loudest voices that I pay attention to, that's where they are. Excuse me. It's not saying let's burn the whole thing down. It's saying there are things built inside of this system that work against our humanity. If we're able to remove those and put more things in that show people that this matters, that they matter, that their world matters, that what they care about matters, we probably wouldn't even be calling it work.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I stumbled upon this idea of the difference between a goal and an outcome. And it has been personally quite revolutionary, right? And I see it everywhere. I see it in the way we set personal goals. I see it in the way businesses set their goals as well. It's like as individuals, we say things like, my goal is to gain 20 pounds. But gaining 20 pounds is an outcome. It's not a goal, because it's not something that you can just make happen, and it's not something that is fully within your control, because there are forces like genetics that also influence that outcome, right? A goal that is attached to that outcome will be to go to the gym 3 times a week to lift heavy weights. That's a goal, because you're fully in control, and it's something that, is something that you can do. It's something that's actionable. And then I see it in business as well, where companies talk about like employee satisfaction and employee engagement. Well, that's an effect, right?
Yeah.
What is the cause? Like, what are the things that if we did will likely increase the level of satisfaction, will likely increase the level of engagement of our employees? And we do those things. And some of those things is what you've been talking about. People largely want autonomy. They want a perceived sense of control. They want a perceived sense of progress. They want to feel connected. They want meaning and purpose. Like all these things that we know by now, either intuitively or through the extensive research. We know what people need, and the work is just not set up to give people what they need. I think because we are so focused on the effects that we are after, that we forget that like something needs to happen before, in order for those things to become reality. Right.
I completely agree with you. Something that I find as a thread through all of this, in knowing you and getting to know you and other people who are really part of the revolution of changing work, not just the well-being piece or the DE&I piece or the leadership, empathetic leadership piece, or the through thread in all of this is an optimism that it can be better. Like one of my favorite writers, James Baldwin, he was asked often, like, why is he always talking about racism in America? Why is he always highlighting that? And like, Does he believe that things will ever get better? Like, is he just negative? And his response was like, well, first I have to be an optimist because I'm alive. Simply because I exist, I have to be an optimist. But I'm also an optimist because I know we can be better. Like, the reason I'm calling all of this out is because I know we can be better, and we've shown it. That's another thing about all of this. If you are a student of history, or if you pay attention to anything that's happened, we'll say, just to boil it down, in this country over the past 80 years, we can change all of this. It strictly just boils down to, for me, finding the people who want to. Like there's the approach to taking on the whole system, whereas I believe joining in or with co-conspirators that are actually doing the work, and their work may not necessarily be aligned with mine, but they're optimistic and they see a path forward to where these things can change, is all I care about. And that's what I see, that's what I align with, that's what I listen to. And I don't see it as anything that's not attainable, right? We can change the workplace. The workplace has changed. We just have to be mindful of the moments where we revert back to the mean. And even an example of like Zoom forcing people to go back to office, that's just a revert back to the mean. Zoom changed the way that people worked for 2 years, one of the largest performing stocks because of it. And now they're like, look, we want to go back to office. Like, that's revert back to mean, but that shouldn't make that doesn't deter me. That doesn't make me think that the path forward isn't real or isn't worth a bit of struggle or a lot of struggle, right? Like, I think the people who are working on this and the people who are really bumping up against the norms are the most optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, I think, conversations like this should fuel people with optimism. I think stories of success fuel people with optimism. Could you share? I know so much of it just makes sense, and that it shouldn't, at least in my opinion, I don't need to see a data set to know that if people feel good about themselves and if they feel valued and respected and they trust that the people for whom they work have their best interest in mind, that they naturally bring and give more of themselves. Like, I don't need to see data for that. But for those who do, and for those who make decisions that perhaps necessitate these kinds of proof and evidence, like what have you found in terms of evidence of, well, this stuff works?
I'm gonna use an example in my small world of the co-op that my son goes to. My daughter goes there as well. And if you're familiar with the system, it means that we also, as parents, have to show up every once in a while and help the teachers. These teachers make a fraction of what, say, a teacher at a private school would make, or a fraction of what a teacher at like a Montessori school would make. But the way they show up, right? Like, the way they show up every single day, and you can tell when it's like the fake smile, right? You can tell when it's the like, I got to put on a smile because I have 4-year-olds looking at me every day. And if I'm off, they're going to notice it. And then I may destroy their innocence, right? Like, that's real. But these teachers show up every single day. And so the input for me is people who love what they do, people who have what they need to do it. So something that I have to give them credit for is if the teachers need something, they get it. If they need certain books, if they and again, this is a co-op where like if I told you how much when I tell people how much it costs, they don't believe me. And we're talking about like childcare in America, one of the largest expenses anyone can accrue. So when they need something, the woman who runs it finds a way to get it for them. Right? When things kind of go off, they find ways to move through it and work through it together. And as we'll say small as they may be, or as different as the model may seem, it is the model. Because when my kid comes home, he's singing songs in Spanish just as he walks through the kitchen. Right? It's not like say a word in Spanish. It's his living of the education. It's his living of the learning. It's not the just showing up and making sure it sits on paper so that it can provide the teacher in some sense the ability to retain information in a short period of time, but like him really knowing and holding these things. So like that's what I see every day when I drop my kids off and pick them up, that if you give people what they need, they will show up each and every day and love what they do.
Absolutely.
And they will. I don't know if the teachers are overlooking how little they make or if it doesn't matter to them, but it's never a conversation that's popped up. And over the time that we've been there, even in the bump in the teachers making it, the community's paid it. So if we were to think of the co-op as like an organization, right? Let's say like the woman who runs it, I'm going to say her name because she's awesome. Her name's Jody Dawes. And if you're in the Philly area, you should probably send your kids to this co-op. But let's say Jody's the CEO. Let's say we as the parents are the shareholders, right? And let's say the teachers are the employees, and we'll say the kids are the customers. When those teachers show up every day, Jody as a CEO knows every single teacher. Jody as a CEO runs the ship, communicates the ship, has meetings, takes them out for drinks. They do all the stuff. Jody pops into rooms to make sure that everything's going the way that it should be. Asks for resources. If you need it, here. If you don't have it, I'll find a way to get it. Teachers as employees show up every day feeling good, knowing that they have what they need and they can do what they can. Employees, the clients, kids love what they're doing. They're getting better, right? They're growing. We as shareholders continue to invest in the business. We continue to drive that stock price up. When they say they need more, here's more. No questions asked. Like that's the cycle. And I see it every day in that. And it's simple, but like it can all be so simple. One of my favorite quotes ever is from Naval, who started AngelList. And he said that there's no such skill as business. There isn't. We just like to look at certain people, and because it fits into a box and maybe they have a great suit on, that they're a business person. There's no such thing. No such thing. So if that is real, then so can the ability for people to show up every day, do an honest day's work, have the resources they need to do them, feel good about it, go home, and do all of the other things in life that usually outweigh that thing.
Yep.
Usually.
Yep. And the piece that I will add to all of that, which is, one of the points that I usually try to make when I talk about empathy, is that is, by the way, also how you make the most money, if that's all you care about. right? Like if all you care about is productivity and shareholder value, that is, by the way, the path to that is creating the conditions for people to give you their best, for people to show up at their best, and they will make you more money than you could ever dream of. So even if you don't care about the humanity and you really only want to get money and you are looking for strategies to do that, well, that's the recipe. That is the recipe. And I always say that, like, when I talk about empathy in business, of course there is the humanistic and doing good aspect to it. But even when you look at it from a capitalistic lens, in order for you to do well, you need to understand your customers and you need to do whatever is in the best long-term interest. If you want the best out of your employees, you need to care for them and create the conditions for them to show up and to give you their best every day. If you do that, then you make money. That's it.
Can we close this with an analogy that I heard from this really cool guy
Let's.
who worked for Ajax's academy? So he because of course we have to liken everything in life back to football. Right? Everything in life is football.
Because it is. Football is life.
It is. It is. So we were talking about just the idea of business and growing it, and he's very, very, very successful. But something he said that will stick with me for the rest of my life is he was in the system for about 10 years. He was working directly with their sports performance team, the psychologist, all of those people who help develop the youth into what they become. And he said over those 10 years, they were really trying to figure out if there was a way to indicate and measure whether a player would be able to make it through the youth system and play for the first team or not. Right? Like what are the things that have to be there, and can we measure to see what the efficacy of those things are to get them to the next level? And the two things that they found that were undeniable in being the indicators of whether a player was going to make it through the academy or not were, one, what was their support system like? Right? If they had a great support system, now let's liken this to business, right? If they have a great manager, right? If they have great teammates, if they have clear leadership, if they have a good mentor, right? We'll say maybe those are the four pieces, and maybe five if we're, got to give Gallup a shout out if they have a best friend at work, right? Those would be the five pieces, their support system. If they have a strong support system, there is a high likelihood that they have a chance at making it through the academy into the first team. The second piece that really drove them to seeing like, okay, this always has to be in place so that we can give our kids the best chance to make it to ultimately where they want to. How well do they take advantage of the resources available to them? So the support system and the resources. Now, mind you, this is, it's one of the best youth systems, if not the best youth system in the world. They have everything at their disposal. That doesn't mean that they're all going to use it. That doesn't mean that they're all going to take advantage of it. But the ones who do, and the ones who have the support there, they felt good enough after a decade to say, that kid's going to get some full team minutes. That kid's going to get some first team minutes. Like, that's a very simple recipe. A very simple recipe in one of the most difficult, competitive, performance-led environments in the world. And we're talking about kids. We're not even talking about adults, whose brains have fully formed and whose identities are, we're talking about kids who are battling still all of those things and puberty and all of that. But these two things, if they're in place, and this child has that and takes advantage of what they need, they can predict that they'll be on the world stage.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no reason why in the workplace we can't see that the very same two things being there for every single person so that they too can get first team minutes.
Absolutely. This is a good place as any to close this amazing conversation. You know, I think in the end, human beings are fairly predictable, and how they will respond to the environment is fairly predictable as well. And I think it's just a matter of us putting in place and enacting on all the information that we have about human beings and how they respond to different kinds of environment, and to designing based on the outcomes that we want. But again, it takes for us to be highly aware of what the inputs are, and letting the outcomes, well, just be the outcomes. Dante, as expected, this was an amazingly enlightening conversation. And, you know, I always have so much admiration and respect for my guests, which is why I asked them to be on in the first place. And you are no exception. I am such a big fan of your worldview, the way you show up, the bravery with which you show up, and the important work that you help lead. So on behalf of all those who are the beneficiary of the internal work and the bravery that you have to bring, I wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, bro. Thank you. I appreciate this space. I really do.